Hello and welcome to this session, and in this session we shall continue our understanding of the different types of verbs. Basically, in this session we will have to understand the difference between the transitive verbs and the intransitive verbs, and let me tell you that this difference is based on the presence or the absence of the object. Well, if the object is present, then such a verb is what we refer to as the transitive verb, and just in case the object is not present, then we refer to the verb as an intransitive verb. Well, I'm sure at this point in time it is not clear, but let me assure you that by the end of this video you would have definitely understood the distinction between the transitive and the intransitive verbs, and you shall be able to also use it in your written and spoken English communication. Anyway, let me proceed and tell you as to what really the transitive and the intransitive verbs are. Firstly, let me begin with the transitive verbs, and you know what? The transitive verbs are such verbs that require one or more objects to complete their meaning. Basically, they help in providing a complete and clear meaning to the sentence. In fact, transitive verbs are essential in sentences because they indicate as to what the action of the verb is being transferred to. Well, understanding how to identify and use transitive verbs correctly is important for constructing grammatically correct and meaningful sentences. Anyway, what does all of this mean? Let me explain it to you through a few examples. Have a look at this example. She reads. Well, in this sentence, reads definitely happens to be the verb, but then the question is whether it is the transitive verb or the intransitive verb. Well, even before I tell that, let me tell you that she happens to be the subject, but then the sentence as a whole doesn't make any meaning because there is no object at all in the sentence. What I mean to say is that she reads is fine, but then what is it that she is reading? Is she reading a book? Is she reading a newspaper? Or what is it that she is reading is not yet clear in this sentence. In other words, what I mean to say is that it is the object that is missing in this sentence. And let me tell you, the moment I bring in an object here, a book, now you can notice that the sentence becomes a meaningful sentence. Now, have a look at the characteristics of the transitive verb. What it tells is that a transitive verb is such a verb that compulsorily requires a direct object to receive the action. And here you can notice that a book is the object and it is receiving the direct action of reading. And you also know that the transitive verbs in many way answers the question as to what. In other words, now we don't have a question at the back of our mind as to what is it that she is reading. The sentence is pretty clear that she is reading a book. In other words, what I mean to say is that reads is such a verb that requires an object compulsorily, and hence we categorize reads as a transitive verb. Hope I am clear with this. Anyway, let me give you a few more examples. Have a look at this sentence. Again, in this sentence, you know that kicked happens to be the verb, but then the question is whether it is the transitive verb or the intransitive verb. Anyway, by now I'm sure you understand that he happens to be the subject in this sentence. But then again, as a whole, the sentence doesn't make any complete meaning because we do not know as to what he kicked. Whether he kicked another person or whether he kicked a rock or what is it that he kicked is not really completely clear. And let me tell you that here, the moment I bring in the object, the ball, now the sentence becomes completely clear. In other words, kicked is such a verb that to bring in a complete meaning, it would require an object to receive the action of kicking, and here the object happens to be the ball, and such verbs that compulsorily require an object so that the action is transferred onto the object is what we refer to as the transitive verbs. Well, in the name itself, there is transitive, meaning that they would necessarily require an object so that they can transit or transfer the action. Hope I am clear with this example as well. Have a look at this next example. Well, in this, writes happens to be the verb. She happens to be the subject, and you know that the sentence as such doesn't make any complete meaning because what she writes is still not clear. Whether she writes poems, whether she writes essays, whether she writes stories, that is not clear. And the moment I bring in an object here, letters, now the question what is addressed? In other words, the object letter indicates that it is receiving the action of writing. In other words, writes happens to be a transitive verb since the action of writing is transferred or transited onto the object, that is the letters. All said and done, writes in this sentence happens to be a transitive verb because it requires an object to receive its action. Have a look at this last example. They built. Well, built is a verb, but then what they have built is not clear. Did they build a house? Did they build a ship? What is it that they really built? Well, the moment I bring in an object here, now the sentence becomes a meaningful sentence. In other words, built happens to be such a verb that requires an object to receive the action of building. In other words, such verbs that compulsorily require an object to make meaningful sentences is what we refer to as the transitive verbs. Well, now if you would look back at the characteristics of the transitive verbs, I am sure you can understand that they are such verbs that compulsorily require an object to receive the action of the verb, and secondly, they address the question of what. Well, in the first case, she reads what? A book answered the question of what. In the second case, he kicked what? The ball answered the question of the what. In the third case, letters addressed the question of what, and in the fourth case, a house addressed the question of what. All said and done, I am sure now the concept of transitive verbs is fairly clear, but then when I would take up the concept of intransitive verbs, it shall become completely clear to you. So let me proceed and now tell you as to what really the intransitive verbs are. Intransitive verbs, as the name suggests, happen to be such verbs that do not require a direct object to complete their meaning. What I mean to say is that these are such verbs that express actions but then do not require any object to pass on that action. What I also mean to say is that the action of the intransitive verb is complete in itself and that they do not need any object. Well, if all of this is pretty confusing, let me give you a few examples to clarify it. Now, have a look at this same example. Well, you already know that in this case, reads happens to be a transitive verb because it is transferring the action of reading to the object, which is a book. Obviously, the subject here happens to be she. But then, what if I write it like this? Well, again you can notice that this sentence happens to be an incomplete sentence because it has only the subject and the verb, but then the object is not there. The point is, always the object need not be there. Well, what I mean to say is that just in case I put in a word quietly here, obviously quietly is not an object, but then the sentence definitely is a meaningful sentence. She reads quietly, obviously is a meaningful sentence, but then you can notice that in this case, the verb is not expecting an object to transfer the action. Rather, here quietly happens to be an adverb. Well, what is an adverb is something that you shall be learning moving forward in this course. But then, definitely at this point in time, I am sure you are able to understand that quietly is not an object. Well, what this means is that this sentence is a meaningful sentence despite the fact that it doesn't have an object. And such verbs which do not expect a direct object, which are complete by themselves, is what we refer to as the intransitive verb. In other words, in this sentence, reads happens to be the intransitive verb. So, all said and done, just by looking at the verb, it is not possible to ascertain if it is a transitive or an intransitive verb, because in the first sentence, reads happens to be a transitive verb, but then in the second sentence, it happens to be an intransitive verb. All said and done, what I mean to say is that for you to decide if really a verb is transitive or intransitive, you need to look at the whole sentence. I'm sure now you have been able to understand that intransitive verbs happen to be such verbs which do not require a direct object and that they are complete by themselves. Anyway, when I will give you a few more examples, the concept shall be completely clear. Now, have a look at this example. Again, here kicked happens to be the transitive verb because the action of kicking is getting transferred into the object, which is the ball. Obviously, he happens to be the subject here. But then have a look at this sentence. Here, you can notice that there is no object at all. Obviously, hard is not an object, rather it is an adverb. Anyway, what is an adverb is something that I have already told you that you shall understand moving forward in this course. But all said and done, hard is definitely not an object. But then the sentence happens to be a meaningful sentence, which means that in this sentence, kicked is meaningful even without the presence of an object. In other words, in the second sentence, kicked happens to be an intransitive verb. Hope it is clear. Now, have a look at this example. Here, you know that writes happens to be a transitive verb because it is transmitting the action of writing to the object, that is the letters. But then, in this sentence, there is no object. Daily, definitely it's not an object, it is an adverb. And the writes here is not demanding an object, and yet the sentence is a meaningful sentence. So, though in the first case, writes happens to be a transitive verb, in the second sentence, writes happens to be an intransitive verb. Hope it is clear. Finally, look at this example. Obviously, here built happens to be a transitive verb because it is transmitting the action of building to an object, which is the house. But then have a look at this. Again, in this case, there is no object. Though built happens to be a verb, it is not demanding an object because quickly obviously is not an object, it is an adverb. Though there is no object, the sentence is a meaningful sentence, which means that the verb here is not demanding an object and hence can be categorized as an intransitive verb. So, all said and done, I am sure now you can understand both the characteristics of the transitive verb as well as the characteristics of the intransitive verb completely. But then let me give you a few more examples wherein we have both the transitive and the intransitive verb in a single sentence. Have a look at this example. He ran quickly and caught the ball. Well, in this sentence, he happens to be the subject and the ball happens to be the object. And I'm sure you can also notice that ran and caught happens to be representing actions and hence they are the verbs. But then the real question is, amongst the two verbs, which one is the transitive and which one is the intransitive verb? Well, that way I'm sure by now you are able to identify that caught is such a verb which definitely requires an object, which is the ball. Just in case I remove the ball here, obviously he ran quickly and caught, but then what did he catch is the question. In other words, without the object the ball here, the verb caught doesn't make any sense. In other words, caught is such a verb which definitely requires an object so that the action of catching can be transferred or transited to the object. In other words, I'm sure by now you understand that caught happens to be a transitive verb. But then ran definitely is not a transitive verb because you can see that after ran, we immediately do not have any direct object into which the running action is being transited. Rather, quickly that is there here happens to be an adverb. Again, what is an adverb? We shall learn about it later, but at least you understand that ran is such a verb which is not demanding an object, and hence I am sure you understand that ran can be categorized as an intransitive verb. Hope this is clear. Now, look at this example. She laughed loudly and told a funny joke. Well, in this case, she happens to be the subject, a funny joke happens to be the object, and obviously laughed and told are the two verbs. But then, which amongst them is the transitive and which is the intransitive verb? Well, to decide that, all that I have to do is to remove the object. And now if I would read the sentence, she laughed loudly and told, but then the question is, what did she tell? Because the sentence as such is incomplete. In other words, the verb told definitely expects the object, and you know that such verbs that compulsorily expect an object to be present after them to receive the action is what we categorize as the transitive verb. But then, if you would look at laughed, you can notice that soon after that we do not have any direct object, rather we have loudly, which is actually an adverb. In other words, laughed in this sentence is such a verb which is not demanding a direct object and hence can be categorized as an intransitive verb. Finally, have a look at this example. They arrived early and prepared the presentation. In this, they happened to be the subject, the presentation is the object, and arrived and prepared happens to be the verb. And you know that the moment I remove the object, the word prepared really doesn't make any sense. In other words, prepared happens to be such a verb which demands the object and hence can be categorized as the transitive verb, whereas arrived definitely is not expecting a direct object and hence can be categorized as the intransitive verb. So, all said and done, I am sure in this video you have been able to understand the categorization of the verbs into transitive and intransitive depending upon the availability or the unavailability of the object in the sentence. I'm sure you have been able to understand all of these categorizations, but then there are a few more categorizations that you really need to understand. And if you have to understand all the remaining categorizations and gain mastery over the concept of verbs, then meet me in the next session. Thanks for watching. Let's meet again in my next session.